so that people that are absent can do it. So I'm going to just back up and start that over again. In the water cycle, we have this H2O molecule, and it always remains H2O. It has 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. We're talking about the movement of this molecule from one part of the world to another. It might evaporate into the atmosphere and then rain down to the ocean, or it might freeze into a glacier. So it might go from liquid to solid to gas, but it always remains water. And this is different than the carbon cycle. So for example, this is now a model of a carbon dioxide molecule. Maybe you guys remember we made these in class a couple months ago. So carbon is this black one in the center, and the oxygens are these red ones out here. So sometimes the carbon atom is in carbon dioxide, but other times it's rearranged and we get something like this, which is a sugar molecule. This has 6 carbon atoms, but it was formed by breaking carbon dioxide molecules apart. So we're not following a single molecule. Instead, we're following an atom. And sometimes it's in one molecule, like carbon dioxide. Sometimes it's in another molecule, like sugar. So that's a little different than the water cycle, because we have to look at some chemical reactions and the way that carbon is moving from one molecule to another through these chemical reactions. You can see carbon dioxide is quite different than this glucose sugar model, right? So our definition of the carbon cycle, right here, the movement of carbon atoms between different parts of the Earth, between the different spheres. Okay, so the water cycle and carbon cycle are not the only cycles. There's also a nitrogen cycle, a sulfur cycle, a phosphorus cycle. All these molecules that we need to live, our bodies are made of these things. They move through the world. They move from the solid part of the Earth, the geosphere, to the liquid part, to the living part in us, the biosphere. And the carbon cycle is connected to the oxygen cycle because of these 2 chemical reactions, photosynthesis and respiration. Is that the next thing on the guided notes, to name the 2 chemical reactions? Here they are: photosynthesis, respiration. These are chemical reactions where molecules are rearranged, their atoms are disconnected and rebuilt, as if this was a bunch of Tinker Toys. I could take this apart and rebuild this, right? That's what's happening in these chemical reactions of photosynthesis and respiration. And then it asks you to write down the equations, doesn't it? Write down the chemical reactions. Yeah, so here it is. Photosynthesis is CO2 plus water plus energy. In this case, it would be light. And then you draw an arrow, and the way we read the arrow is yields. Just like you know how to read an equal sign, you say equals, huh? Or if you see a plus sign, you say plus. So when you see this arrow, you say yields. Carbon dioxide plus water plus energy yields glucose sugar plus oxygen. So that's our chemical reaction in photosynthesis. That should actually be a review from back when you took biology as a freshman. Then when you write down the chemical reaction for respiration, you just write the same thing, but you write it backwards. I took a shortcut by just having one arrow for photosynthesis going to the right and another arrow for respiration going to the left. So for your respiration equation, it's the same as photosynthesis, but it's a mirror image. It should say glucose sugar plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide plus water plus energy. You just flip them around. One equation is the opposite of the other. So here's what's going on. The carbon dioxide that's part of the atmosphere is absorbed through the leaves of plants. So plants absorb the CO2 through their leaves. They also absorb water, but this is now coming up from their roots underground, right? Then they use the sunlight to rearrange those molecules. It actually takes 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules to make 1 sugar molecule. And there are different kinds of sugars. Their name always ends with ose. I'm sure you've heard of lactose, the sugar in milk that some people can't tolerate. If they can't digest it, we say they're lactose intolerant. But the basic sugar that's made by plants is called glucose, and this is a model of glucose. It has 6 carbons in it that came from these 6 carbon dioxide molecules. They've been rearranged and rebuilt into this molecule. And then this can be rearranged to make other sugars like lactose, or it can be rearranged to make the wood in the trunk of a tree, or the stem of a plant, or it's used to build the petals of a flower. So this glucose ends up in different parts of the plant. And then animals will eat the plant to get that glucose. And this is how animals get their energy. So we're talking about the food web now, where the carbon is moved from one organism to another. The animal, maybe an herbivore, eats the plant, and then the carnivore eats the herbivore, right? They're getting energy, but they're also getting this carbon atom. Our bodies are mostly built of this carbon. We have lots of water in our bodies, but the actual structures of our body are made from carbon. So we need carbon in our food. That's how we get food. So it starts with photosynthesis, where the plant builds the sugar. Then it goes through the food web to give us the carbon that we need. And then any extra carbon that we don't need, we exhale, we breathe it out from respiration, which I think is kind of crazy. We gain carbon from our food, we release carbon from respiration, which means whatever you just ate during the nutrition break, the carbon that was in the food you just ate, you're going to breathe it out. So you eat the carbon, your body converts it into carbon dioxide gas, and you exhale it. So we see these big changes going on in carbon. So look at this carbon cycle at its most basic level. Carbon in the air is absorbed by plants for photosynthesis. Then the carbon moves through food webs. Then respiration returns that carbon to the air in the form of carbon dioxide. And I think one of your questions on the guided notes has to do with this. Describe the movement of the carbon through the food web or something like that, right? Oh, through ecosystems, yeah. So focus on the carbon. Our whole point is to follow what's happening with carbon. And the reason we're doing this in earth science, it's kind of a review of biology, but we're doing it in earth science because we're studying the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide, this guy, has a big influence on the characteristics of the atmosphere, especially the temperature of the atmosphere. So we need to know about the carbon cycle. And you might recall that diagram that I gave you the pretest on. That was the carbon cycle, and that's going to be our focus, is looking at the details of the carbon cycle. But we want to start by looking at the most basic carbon cycle. It only has 3 parts: photosynthesis, eating, and respiration. Plants take in the carbon and they build food out of it. Animals eat it, and then animals release it back to the air through respiration. Now, this happens in both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. It occurs both on land in the terrestrial ecosystem, and it occurs underwater in the aquatic ecosystem. The carbon is moving along. It also happened long ago, And this has big implications for our climate today. So yeah, we have the carbon cycle happening today of photosynthesis, eating, and respiration, but it also happened in the days of the dinosaurs, where plants that were alive then were absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. Herbivorous dinosaurs were eating them. Carnivorous dinosaurs ate the herbivores. And then all those dinosaurs released carbon dioxide back into the air. So it cycled, made this loop. And so what we're going to see when we look at the diagram is that same thing 3 different times. We're going to repeat ourselves a little bit with photosynthesis, eating, and respiration. We're going to see it on land, we're going to see it underwater, and we're going to see it long ago in the Paleozoic era. Oh, and the next thing, on your paper, you should find a diagram that looks like this guy. It looks like this carbon dioxide molecule. So what I want you to do is 2 things. I want you to put the label on it of carbon dioxide. And then I want you to draw an arrow and point out the carbon atom in the middle of it, that black carbon atom in the center of it. The same thing is true, I think, on the bottom corner of that paper. You're going to find a model, a diagram of glucose, sugar. So I want you to label the glucose sugar, and then I want you to draw an arrow pointing out the carbon atom. The carbon is this black one. We generally use different colors to represent different atoms. So red is often oxygen because it's a component of blood. Black is often carbon because when we burn things, the ashes are black and they're primarily carbon. So label those diagrams. I would suggest, if you can, to use an arrow. If you're not sure how to get to that, if you go to these shapes right here and you click on them, then you can draw an arrow. So I'm drawing it the wrong way. I'm going to draw it in the direction I want the arrow to be pointing. So I can do this, and I can then label that as a carbon atom. So you should have 2 labels on there. One for the atom and another for the molecule. So the whole thing is a carbon dioxide molecule. This particular molecule has 3 atoms in it, 1 carbon and 2 oxygens. And you're going to do the same thing down in the bottom corner for the glucose sugar. You don't have to point out every carbon atom, but point out one of them. It should also be black. And let's do one other thing also. Let's show the chemical formula. So for carbon dioxide, it's CO2. That's why we say dioxide. Di means 2, oxygen is oxide, so dioxide means 2 oxygens. Down here with the glucose, I'll give you its chemical formula, C6H12O6. So in this glucose sugar, we have 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. That carbon came from the carbon dioxide. The plant converted it to sugar by photosynthesis. Keeps us alive. Down here on your diagram on your notes, also put the name of that molecule, glucose sugar. and draw an arrow to point to one of the carbon atoms. You guys get those labels okay? Yeah? Jessica? Good. All right. Now, on the next slide on the PowerPoint, there's a bunch of vocabulary. And on the PowerPoint, it's alphabetized. But here on your notes, they're the same definitions, but they're in random order. So I want you to read through the slide and find the matching vocabulary term and then fill that in on the blank. Okay? So they're not in order though, so be careful, make sure you get the right one. Okay? So match these definitions to the ones on your paper. They're in scrambled order. Take about 5 minutes to do that and then we'll move on. How are you guys doing? You finished? Yeah. You done with that? How about you? You finished too? Cool. All right, so we should be about finished with this. There's a couple of these I want to point out a little bit about. So let's start with fossil fuel. You know, when we hear that, when we hear the word fossil, we usually think of dinosaurs, right? In fact, there's even one gas station that has a dinosaur as part of its logo. So when we're burning gasoline, are we actually burning parts of dinosaurs? Not really. What we are burning, though, is remains of plants from the time of the dinosaurs. If you look at any ecosystem, it's dominated by plants. You see plants everywhere. And now and then you might see an animal, huh? But you see tons of plants, which means there's a lot more material of leftover plant life that can become a fossil. And the carbon that was in those living plants at one time gets compressed and it becomes what we call a fossil fuel. Here's one of them right here. This is a piece of coal. I don't know if you've ever seen coal before, but coal is a major fossil fuel. So there used to be, before the time of the dinosaurs, there would be forests and swamps where the plants would grow and then they'd die. New ones would grow, they'd die, and all the dead ones are getting stacked up on top of each other over time. Sediments are covering them up. They're getting buried deeper and deeper and deeper, and the pressure squeezes the remains of those plants into this material called coal. If it gets deep enough, it can also start to heat up and it gets cooked. And all the material that used to look like a plant is pretty much gone. Although to me, this looks a bit like a piece of burned wood, huh? But this one piece of coal is concentrated with the molecules that give us energy. This one piece of coal probably has as much energy as like a whole stump of a tree, a round of firewood. So this might have enough energy to keep you warm all night. All right? Very concentrated form of energy. And so when we discovered we could get the energy from it by burning it, we started using it a lot, huh? And that was a couple hundred years ago at the beginning of what we call the Industrial Revolution. Um, Yesterday, somebody asked why don't we use it more? Well, we still use it all the time, but we found that other types of fuel are more efficient. For one, coal is solid, so it's a little more difficult to transport. And things like gasoline being a liquid, it's easy to move it around. Also, with coal, it's kind of messy. It leaves a lot of dust whenever you work with it. So at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we were really only using coal, and people started using it not only in factories, but also for heat at home. And it would probably be the teenager's job to shovel the coal into the furnace down in the basement. But first, you got to get it down to the basement, so you also have to have it gets delivered at your street, and then you have to move it into your storage compartment, your storage bin, or whatever you keep your coal. So it was a lot of work to deal with coal, and it was dirty. And not only that, the smoke that's released from coal is pretty dirty too. So there were actually some events in London in the Industrial Revolution where the smog was so thick that people were dying. Mostly people that had a weak respiratory system to begin with, but the pollution was bad enough that it would kill people. We call them killer smogs. So this is our first fossil fuel, this solid fossil fuel, coal. Then another type of fossil fuel that we use probably daily here is gasoline, right? And gasoline is a fossil, but it's really a fossil of algae. So imagine taking a bunch of algae and running it through a screen, grinding it up, flattening it out, squeezing all the oils out of those algae cells. In fact, this is one of the things we're trying to do to make renewable fuel right now, is grow algae in a laboratory and then remove the oils from it that we can then burn. But the gasoline we're burning now is from these ancient algae that lived around the time of the dinosaurs, like 100 million years ago. And so that algae, that fossil fuel, comes out of the ground as crude oil. So crude oil is this thick black material. It's like, imagine syrup, but even thicker, maybe like honey, kind of oozing along, except completely black, right? That would be crude oil. Then what we can do with crude oil is we can separate it out because it's a whole mixture of different things. That's why we say it's crude. It's not been purified. Crude is the opposite of pure in this case. So the crude oil contains a variety of things. We can purify parts of it, one component of it, to get gasoline. We purify another part of it to get diesel fuel. Another part is really thick, and we use that to make asphalt. Another part is very fine, very low density. Remember we talked about different densities of things, huh? And that we could use for jet fuel. All of these come from crude oil. Also the plastics, like I'm wearing this Highlander shirt that's a polyester. This is from crude oil. This particular fabric is from crude oil. That they take the oil molecules and they stretch them out into these long strands that we can then use to weave a fabric. So all plastic is from crude oil, and so it's gasoline and diesel and jet fuel. And the place that separates them out is down here at the bottom. It's called a refinery. This is the factory that purifies the crude oil. It refines it. It makes it more pure. That's why we call it a refinery. It separates out the different components of crude oil. And the last two I want to talk about here are easily confused: global warming and the greenhouse effect. What I want you to think about is that one of these is the cause of changes and the other is the result. And you can kind of tell, well, actually it's backwards. The greenhouse effect is the process where glass in a greenhouse traps heat. You experience this every time you go out to your car. It's been parked in the sun, it's all hot inside, right? That is the greenhouse effect. So what happens is the light from the sun can go through the glass, and once it hits the upholstery of your car, once it hits the seats, it's converted to heat. But that heat cannot escape from the glass. It's kind of strange. Light can go through glass, but heat cannot, or at least not as easily. And so the inside of the car traps that heat. This is called the greenhouse effect. And what we've learned is that our atmosphere acts the same way as the glass in the greenhouse. The atmosphere traps heat. Different molecules that do this are called greenhouse gases. And the most important one for us is carbon dioxide. So the greenhouse effect is the cause. The result is global warming. We know that carbon dioxide is able to trap heat. In fact, they've known this since the 1800s. We've known that CO2 traps heat. Over 100 years, like 150 years, we've known this molecule traps heat. So, what is going to be the result of putting more of it into the atmosphere every day? That becomes a big question. So think of these two, greenhouse effect and global warming, as cause and effect. The origin is the greenhouse effect. The result is the warming of the globe. Okay? Skip that. All right, so if you took the pretest, you saw this diagram already. I'm going to tell you that this is also on the test at the end of this unit. This diagram makes up half of your test at the end of the unit, which won't be till probably a couple weeks after we get back from break next week. All right, but this is a major part of your exam. And basically, It shows the carbon cycle. So what I want you guys to take a couple minutes to do is go to the diagram on your notes. It should be there. What did I just say the title of it should be? What did I say this whole thing shows? The carbon cycle, exactly. So that should be the title, the carbon cycle, and you are going to add the numbers in here. So go ahead and take a minute to add all those numbers, and then we're going to talk about them. It's kind of a different kind of a test where you're labeling a diagram with 25 different numbers on it. Um, Basically, it becomes a written test where you just, I could have just said, describe all the details of the carbon cycle. But instead of doing that, I broke it apart and I gave you these hints by giving you the diagram, huh? Okay, so I'm gonna walk you through this carbon cycle real quickly, and then we'll look at the details. So, let's see, I need my pen. Basically, remember a few minutes ago, I was talking about the simplest version of the carbon cycle. Always keep that in mind when you're looking at this. Basically, the first half of it, the upper half, is all of what happens in nature, and the lower half shows how people have altered the carbon cycle. And at the most basic level, it's just 1, 2, 3. So carbon is in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. On your test, if you say carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that's probably going to give you 1 point for saying it's carbon dioxide, another point for saying it's in the air. But if you want more points, see, the way this test works is you build your score. It's not like I ask you questions and I take points away. Instead, the more things you tell me, the more points you earn, right? So you just said carbon dioxide, it's in the atmosphere. If you tell me the amount that's in the atmosphere, you're going to get another point. If you tell me what it's made of, you say carbon dioxide, and you say it's made of 1 carbon atom attached to 2 oxygen atoms. That's another point. See how that works? The more things you tell me, and the more details you give me, the more points you get. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's made of 1 carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms, and it's about 400 what we call ppm, parts per million. That means for every million air molecules, 400 of them are carbon dioxide. Okay? Now, it used to be, before the Industrial Revolution began, it used to be about 280. So it's gone up in about 150 years, 200 years. It's gone from 280 to 400. Actually, we're now at 410. When I first started teaching this, like 10 years ago, it was around 380. Now we're up to 410. But anyway, that's number 1. Number 2, trees, grasses, plants in general, all these plants absorb CO2 and they use photosynthesis to make glucose sugar. Now, if you give me the equation for photosynthesis, should that be a bonus point? If you write down carbon dioxide plus water plus light yields glucose plus oxygen, right? We wrote that down on the first page. You get a bonus point there, wouldn't you? So you want to build your points. Your goal is to get 2 points for every number. Some of them it's going to be easy to get 2. Some of them you can get 4 or 5. Some of them it's going to be hard to get 2. So you might want to make sure you get some of the extra points elsewhere. All right? So photosynthesis converts that carbon dioxide into sugar. Number 3, animals eat the sugar and they release carbon dioxide back to the air using respiration. Okay? This is our most basic carbon cycle. Look over here, it's repeated again. But this time it's underwater. And so you wouldn't want to say exactly the same thing to get points. Like if you gave me the equation for photosynthesis here, you've already done that. So you don't give me the equation again, do you? Although it's happening here. So number 4, yes, it's carbon dioxide in the air, but you want to say it dissolves into the water. And then algae absorbs the carbon dioxide to conduct photosynthesis. So these little circles are algae cells, single-celled plants that live in the water. They conduct photosynthesis, and then fish eat the algae to get their carbon to build their bodies, and they release CO2 back into the water, which then leaves the water, goes back to the air. Right? We see this happening again over here. The same thing. See how I've repeated it 3 times now? When you first look at a huge diagram like this with 25 things, it looks overwhelming, huh? But if we break it down into sections, then you can handle it better, I think. And that's what we're going to do as we go through this today and when we practice it later. Here it's the same thing with carbon dioxide in the air, photosynthesis, eating, respiration returns it, but now it's in the ancient past. That's why we have this Stegosaurus here, just to represent that this was long ago, millions of years ago. Here's some kind of palm tree that lived back then, right? Same, all of these are basically the same as one another, okay? But now let's look at one other part of the natural carbon cycle, which is right here. So the algae are also starting the food chain for creatures like snails. Any creature with a shell is what we're talking about here. I've just drawn a snail, but it could also be a clam or an oyster or a scallop. It could be coral, especially coral. So these organisms have a shell, and the shell is made of a molecule called calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate. The important thing we're paying attention to is the carbon, because we're following the carbon as it moves from one part of the environment to another. So the carbon that was once in this CO2 absorbed by the algae to build sugar, now the sugar is rearranged to make the shell of the snail in the form of calcium carbonate. I want to erase that because it's in my way. Okay. Well, eventually, you know that snail is going to die. But its shell will last a long time, Whether it's a clamshell or coral, whatever, those shells build up in the sediments on the sea floor. And they get buried deeper and deeper over time. And the pressure on the shell layer ends up converting those shells into a rock. That rock is often limestone, but it could also be dolomite. But the carbon is still there that was once in the shell, And so as a group, we call these carbonate rocks. That makes sense? Next, what can happen over millions of years, this is a very slow part of the cycle now. The first part was pretty fast. This can happen in days, But this next part takes millions of years, where these carbonate rocks from plate tectonics can get subducted, and then they can erupt out of a volcano. And the carbon that was once in the rock that came from the snail shell is then returned to the air again. And so we have another part of the carbon cycle making this big loop involving plate tectonics. So how do people influence the carbon cycle? Well, since the Industrial Revolution, we've had a lot of impact. So not only do the snail shells build up in the sediments, but also the algae builds up in the sediments. And remember I was talking about how we can compress algae and convert it into crude oil? That's exactly what happens deep underground, is these sediments take the thick layers of millions of years worth of algae, compresses them into crude oil. And so from deep in the ocean, we end up with a layer underground that is packed with oil. So number 13 there is crude oil. What do we do then? Well, we use an oil well to pump it up. And you know how maybe you've seen these oil wells before? They kind of they rock back and forth to pump the oil out of the ground. So we pump the oil out of the ground there, and then we put it into a truck. The truck takes that crude oil to, remember the name of the factory that separates the crude oil into the different components? It makes gasoline and diesel. It makes asphalt and plastic. This is a refinery. So for number 16, you need to tell me that's a refinery. The reason this has these layers drawn on here is because we separate the oil by its density. The lightest weight components, the least density, float to the top. The heaviest things sink to the bottom. So we get these layers. Asphalt is at the bottom, jet fuel is at the top, gasoline is in between. Underneath the gasoline is motor oil you would put in your car's engine. So then we send the gasoline to a variety of things represented by this car. And when we burn the gasoline, the carbon that was in the gasoline that came from the crude oil, that came from the ancient algae, is now returned to the atmosphere. So we have this loop. I'm going to redraw it by erasing everything. It's getting a little messy in there, huh? So we have this loop where we've gone from carbon dioxide, long ago carbon dioxide, during the ages of the dinosaurs. The algae absorbed it. The algae became, when they died, they built up in the sediments. That became crude oil. And we sent that to our cars, which returns it to the air again. I want you to think about something. How long did this part take right here to go from algae living in the ocean before we dug it up again? Wasn't that millions of years that that carbon was stored underground? These algae, they were alive during the time of the dinosaurs. 100 million years ago, the carbon that they absorbed from the atmosphere was trapped underground. And now we're taking that carbon that's been stored underground for millions of years, and we're putting it back in the air. And this is why the amount of carbon dioxide in the air has gone from 280 to 410 in a relatively short period of time. Compared to the millions of years that it was stored underground, we've rapidly moved it back into the atmosphere. We're changing the carbon cycle. Whatever your political beliefs, whatever you think would happen because of this carbon being there, we know for sure that we are increasing the amount of CO2 in the air. This is a fact. The question is not whether this is happening or not. We are putting more CO2 into the air that was once underground. The question is what's going to happen because of that. We know we're doing it. We're conducting a giant experiment on the planet. What are the results going to be? That's what we're studying here. Now, it isn't only from oil that this is happening, right? It's not the only fossil fuel. So let's look at the next part. If we go back to the ancient plants, this is actually from before the time of the dinosaurs. When these guys die, their remains become coal. So down here, number 18, sometimes people have a hard time recognizing what this is. That's not a pile of stuff. That's a hole in the ground. We can see that there's these different layers in that hole. Okay? And that truck is not putting anything into the hole. It's taking stuff away from the hole. So this is supposed to represent a coal mine. The black layers are the coal that were once trees and other plants from swamps and forests. They got compressed into this coal. This is like 200 million years old. This piece of coal, 200 million years ago, this was a living plant. And it's been buried underground all that time, huh? We dig up the coal, we put it in a truck. The truck brings it to a variety of factories, but the most important one for us today is the electrical power plant. So this factory is making electricity. And then it is releasing the CO2 back into the atmosphere. Along the way, it sends the electricity down these power lines into our houses, huh? So we're using the electricity, but we're not actually burning the coal, are we? Like the lights in this room, they are not, I'm not burning the coal that gave me that light, right? But out in the middle of Nevada, there is a power plant that is burning coal to make the electricity that I'm using right now. Now, if we convert to other sources of electricity, we don't have that impact. But this is an indirect addition to the greenhouse effect, indirect addition of CO2. It's not you and me putting CO2 into the air. Like every time we start our car, it is you and me putting CO2 into the air, huh? It's my engine that I'm starting and burning the gasoline, and my exhaust puts CO2 in the air. Here, I'm not directly doing it when I use electricity, but somebody is putting CO2 in the air for me, unless I'm getting my electricity from like a wind turbine, something like that. And then there's two more things. Down here in this corner, we have forest fires. And the carbon that this tree absorbed now goes back to the air, huh? So forest fires add some carbon dioxide to the air, but how old is that tree compared to how old is this coal? This coal is 200 million years old. The carbon has been out of the atmosphere for 200 million years, whereas the tree might be 200 years old. It took carbon out of the air 200 years ago. When it burns, it puts it back in. But this carbon has been out of the air for 200 million years. This is ancient carbon that we're putting back in the air. When this happens, I don't think it changes the carbon dioxide level that much, because the tree isn't that old in comparison to coal or oil or other fossil fuels. And the last thing is this guy chopping down a tree. Deforestation is what this is representing. It's not just one guy chopping down one tree, chopping down whole forests, right? Now, normally when a tree is alive, it would absorb CO2, just like we had up here, huh? When the tree's alive. But if we chop down the tree, it can't absorb that CO2 anymore, does it? So it reduces the amount of carbon dioxide removal from the air. It stops removing CO2. Okay? So that was my quick explanation of what's going on. I know it didn't seem very quick, did it? But let's go ahead and move forward. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this diagram down into these 7 parts to make it easier for our brains to grasp what's going on. Our brains have a hard time remembering more than 7 things. So that diagram of 25 would be really tough. So we're going to break it into these 7 parts. And I'm going to put a bunch of details up on the screen. And I want you to paraphrase, to write down the most important things on your paper. Okay? This PowerPoint is also posted on Teams. So if you want to study the detailed version, you can go back to this PowerPoint. Right now, just get the main things. Okay, so first of all, we have the basic carbon cycle that occurs on land. So you should say that these are carbon dioxide molecules, number 1. If you want, you can say they're made of 1 carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms. You should recognize this number. The amount of carbon dioxide in the air today is 400, we say ppm, parts per million, which is a tiny fraction of 1%. And so some people say that because it's such a small fraction of the atmosphere, it shouldn't matter that much. But actually, it's the opposite. Because it's such a small fraction of the atmosphere, it's easy for people to change that fraction. We can easily influence the amount of CO2 because it's such a small fraction. On the other hand, something like nitrogen gas makes up 80% of the atmosphere. It would be very difficult for us to change the amount of nitrogen in the air. But CO2, we can easily modify that. An important characteristic of CO2 is that it can trap heat. So we want to say these are carbon dioxide. If you want, 1 carbon and 2 oxygen. The amount is good to know, 400 ppm. And it's able to trap heat. Those are the main ideas out of all of that text in there. In step 2, we see plants absorbing the CO2 using photosynthesis. They build sugar from that. And then animals eat to get the carbon we need. We use it for energy, but we also use it to build our tissues. Like our muscles are largely made of carbon atoms. Our DNA is mostly carbon. Then respiration returns CO2 to the atmosphere. And so this by itself is the carbon cycle. You see, we started in the atmosphere, we moved through the biosphere, and we returned to the atmosphere. So when you're studying for this test, you could go to this PowerPoint and look at the diagrams and quiz yourself and then check to see how you did. We're actually going to practice like that a little bit tomorrow. All right, let's move on. Next, basically the whole thing repeats the same 3 steps, but underwater now. Okay, so we're going to say CO2 dissolves into the ocean. We're going to say algae absorbs the CO2 for photosynthesis. Again, if you give me the equation for photosynthesis at some point, that's going to be extra credit. Then let's see, carbon moves through the food web. When one thing eats another thing, it's gaining carbon. Then respiration returns that CO2 back to the water, and it can go back to the air from there as well. So you can paraphrase all of that. One thing this doesn't say that we'll look at a little bit is that CO2 dissolves into water and makes the water a little bit acidic. So we actually can measure that the ocean is becoming slightly more and more acidic over time. It's almost like turning to vinegar, but it's nowhere near that strong. Don't get me wrong. It's a very slight change, but it's enough of a change that the creatures that build their shells out of the carbon are having a hard time. The acid prevents the shell from forming, which could suggest that in the future it might be a little more difficult to find tasty scallops and oysters and things like that. How are we doing? Ready? Everybody doing okay online there? Give me a thumbs up if all is good with you. All right, thanks, Gabriella. Thanks, Wyatt. Cool. Let's move on. Okay, now we're going to talk about what's going on with the rocks that contain carbon. Not all rocks have carbon. Granite does not have carbon in it, but limestone does. So let's see. The aquatic food web also brings carbon to invertebrates such as snails, clams, and coral. Use carbon to build their shells. Of course, they also use the carbon for respiration and energy. The shells have the chemical formula of calcium carbonate. Then, as they die, their shells build up on the seafloor. And the shells become carbonate rocks. Our best example of a carbonate rock is limestone. Marble is another one. You might have marble countertops or something. I'm sure you've seen marble statues. Those are carbonate rocks. At the same time, the remains of decaying algae are converted into crude oil. Then, after millions of years, plate tectonics can move those carbonate rocks. Subduction occurs, melts the rocks, and volcanoes release the carbon back into the atmosphere. Volcanoes release tons of CO2. This natural increase in CO2 in the atmosphere from volcanoes is something we need to account for. So my suggestion for you when you're studying for this exam is to break down that big diagram into these smaller sections. Review one section at a time. That way it's a little less overwhelming and less confusing. All right, next slide. Last part of the natural carbon cycle is the ancient carbon cycle. So this again is a repeat of number 1, 2, and 3. It's just that this took place hundreds of millions of years ago. So CO2 was in the ancient atmosphere. sometime, not always, but sometimes even higher levels than today. Sometimes even more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than we have today. How do we know that? And how can we say that there's more CO2 in the atmosphere now than humans have ever experienced in all of human evolution? There's more CO2 today than any time during our ancestors' lives. Well, the way we can look at ancient carbon levels, there's more than one thing we can do. But the most obvious one is you go to a glacier. And the bottom of the glacier is the oldest ice. And when ice forms, it traps air bubbles in it. And so if you drill through like a mile of ice, you're getting to ice that's 1 million years old at the bottom. And then you can take a syringe and extract that air bubble, and you can measure the amount of CO2 in it. And from that, we see that there is more CO2 today than there was 1 million years ago when humans first evolved. We can also measure CO2 traces from ancient coral and things like this. Okay, next, ancient plants absorb CO2 for photosynthesis. Sometimes their remains were buried and formed coal. If they were from a swamp or a forest that had the right conditions, when the plant died and decayed, it got compressed into coal. This is why we call it a fossil fuel, right? It's an ancient living thing. And of course, the same story for the ancient animals. They get their carbon by eating, return CO2 to the air by respiration. All right, so those first four parts were all about the natural carbon cycle. And now we're going to look at how humans influence that cycle in the last three sections. So this one is all about oil and transportation. So let's see. The crude oil, and also this is true for natural gas, this stored ancient carbon underground for millions of years. That would be the carbon that the algae trapped 100 million years ago during the time of the dinosaurs. Oil is younger than coal in general. Coal is like 200 million years old. Oil is like 100 million years old. And then the oil and gas wells pump them to the surface. We have different ways of transporting the oil. I've drawn a truck there, but it could have also been a pipeline that might be 1,000 miles long. We have pipelines that carry oil from Canada to Louisiana. So we also have trains. We have these giant tanker ships. A crude oil tanker ship carries millions of gallons of oil at once. And all of these are going to burn fossil fuels, releasing more CO2 into the atmosphere. But the big idea is that we're just moving the oil and gas from the well to the refinery. And the refinery is where we take that crude oil and we purify it. We separate it out into different layers by density. These things include gasoline, asphalt, jet fuel, plastics, diesel, motor oil, even more than that. Then we burn the gasoline in a huge variety of machines. Gasoline is so useful because we can easily take the engine that burns it and connect it to different kinds of machinery to do different jobs. We can use that power to turn wheels in a car, but we can also use that power to move a chainsaw or to move a snowblower. We can use it in a jet ski. We can use it in a snowmobile, in a lawnmower. All these things are moving carbon that was once stored underground into the atmosphere. Taking that carbon that had been underground for so long, moving it into the air. This right here, learning about the carbon cycle like this, is what actually convinced me that we need to really take global warming as a serious potential issue. Because we know that we're moving carbon into the air. Maybe we don't know what's going to happen because of that. Most scientists think it's going to cause the planet to warm up. And there's some evidence that that's been happening already. If you think about it, moving the ancient carbon into the air, it's got to do something. Good. Next, we're going to look at coal, and especially we're going to look at how it's used to make electricity. It can be used in other factories, but I think that was more common in the past than it is today. It was very common at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but now it's not quite so common, except for making electricity. So what's going to happen? Coal mines are going to dig up the remains of ancient plants. Those ancient plants, of course, were converted to coal, and that carbon was stored underground for even longer than the oil stored carbon underground. Maybe 200 million years that this coal was underground, maybe 400 million. Then coal is transported from the mine, sometimes in trucks, often in trains, because they need so much of it. So often a power plant, when they build a new power plant somewhere, they'll even build a new train track that goes to the power plant. And they might have 20 carloads of coal that come to them every day. And that's how much coal they burn every day, 20 carloads, 20 train carloads of coal every day to give us the electricity we need. So then we burn the coal, primarily in electrical power plants. And this will make electricity. And then their exhaust adds that ancient carbon to the atmosphere. So the way a power plant works is you need a source of heat at most power plants. In this case, it's coal. We burn the coal. It heats up some water. And that water heats up to make steam. And that steam is compressed, so it's high pressure. And that's used to turn a device called a turbine, which looks like a big fan. So you're spraying this steam onto the turbine, and it's spinning around. And as it spins, it turns a generator. And that generator makes the electricity. It has these this coil of wires in a magnetic field. Once you take a coil of wire and spin it in a magnetic field, it causes electrons to move through the wires. And the moving electrons are electricity. Let's see, then we transfer that electricity along power lines. I don't think you need the part about high voltage and low voltage. Just the electricity is moved on the power lines. Electricity is an amazing source of energy. It's really easy to move it along a wire, although sometimes they don't look so good. They block our views a little bit, but it's easy to move and it's easy to convert from one thing to another. So electricity is great if you want to, I don't know, like in this room, I'm using electricity in how many ways right here? I'm using it for light. When I play a video, I'm using it for sound. I can use it to run my computer. I'm using it to run this air purifier. All these different uses of electricity, right? It's an amazing type of energy. So we use this electricity for many different things. And of course, like I said earlier, using the electricity by us right now doesn't add carbon to the air directly. But if that electricity came from a coal burning power plant or an oil burning power plant or a natural gas power plant, it does add CO2 to the air. There are other ways to make electricity that don't add any carbon to the air. This would include, like, maybe you've heard of hydropower. Like if you know Hoover Dam, when the water falls off the dam, it turns the turbine that turns the generator that makes electricity. There's no carbon involved. Of course, solar power makes electricity without adding any CO2 to the air. So we have alternatives to electricity that don't add CO2. Okay, the last one. Human impacts on forests. So we have forest fires, and they could be natural or they could be caused by people. And it moves CO2 out of the plant back into the air. But this is not ancient carbon, is it? This is recent carbon. So I would argue, like if you have a wood stove or if you have a fireplace and you're burning firewood, you are adding carbon dioxide to the air, but not ancient carbon. Because that tree was alive not that long ago, taking the carbon out of the air to build the wood that you're now burning. That's a lot different than the coal that we're burning that's 200 million years old. So this is, I would call it recent carbon, and it has less of an impact on our CO2 levels than burning the ancient carbon that was isolated from the atmosphere for millions of years. Finally, we have deforestation. And once you chop down a tree, it can no longer remove carbon from the air. And that's why that arrow is crossed out. So trees are able to remove carbon from the air for us, but only when they're alive. So you chop it down, it stops absorbing CO2. Photosynthesis ends. The tree dies. But on the other hand, reforestation does remove carbon dioxide to the air. That's not really shown in the diagram, but if you plant trees, you're increasing the ability of nature to take CO2 out of the air for us. All right, so that's the end of the PowerPoint. At the bottom, there's some questions for you to answer, and then you should turn it in. And then we're done for the day. Thanks for hanging with me. I know that was a long lecture. Not always like that, but today it was. So answer the questions at the bottom, turn it into Teams by clicking the Add Work button and uploading it, and then click Turn In. Also, let me know if you need to see any of the slides that we've gone past. Or again, you'll find this PowerPoint in the files section on Teams, and you can look at it at any time. So I think that if you're at home, that you could go ahead and check out of the video right now, because I don't have anything more to say to you beyond answer those questions at the bottom and turn it in, okay? Let me know if you need to see another slide again, or if you have any questions for me. Same thing for you guys here in the room. If you have any questions, let me know. We're done for the day. Just answer those questions at the bottom and turn it in. Thanks for your patience. Thanks for being here, guys.